Hi everyone, my name is Katharine Finn. I am a IU grad 2014 and a senior consultant here in Chicago at Deloitte Consulting. And it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Franz Gilbert. Franz is the Vice President of the Solution Provider Programs at Deloitte. So his focus on HR technology, specifically the provider community, along with his background in human resources, brings a unique vantage point to understanding the market. And we're excited to have him here this afternoon to speak specifically on how his work on HR analytics applies to everyone's new normal, and probably the topic where you are all a little bit tired of hearing about, but can't avoid anyways, COVID-19. Franz, I'll hand it over to you and let you kick it off.
Fantastic. Well, everyone, good morning, good afternoon. It really is an honor and privilege to talk with you all. And the intent really is to make sure we're serving you well today. So the ask for questions and Q&A is truly important. I did want to start out and because I think everyone does kind of going, why do we what's going on with COVID? At the same time, I wanted to really give you a little bit of a primer on why it's an amazing time to be in people analytics in this space. Right? There's been kind of an explosion. And I wanted to give you some context of how fast the industry has moved. And at some points, how fast it's moved, other points, how nascent it is, and still very much in its beginning. So just as a quick fun factoid, human resources as a corporate function did not exist until 1902. Is the first known HR function that existed in the United States. And then the second one was 1903, and it was Goodrich and the National Cash Register are the two companies that started it. And so realize we had HR going from 1902, SHRM, the Society of HR Management, was created in the 40s. At that time, it was the Society of Personnel Administration. It didn't change its name until 1988. But you look on here and you go, well, it wasn't until 1978 that the first book on HR metrics was created. And it was done by Dr. Jack Fitzsimmons. You'll hear people affectionately call him Dr. Jack. He's amazing, but he was the one that first started coming out with just normal metrics. So things like time to fill, how do you calculate turnover, things like that, right? Very big metrics, but he was the first one saying, if you're in the world of HR, these are things that you ought to be looking at. And so just kind of take that into scope going. It wasn't until 1978 that we just kind of even got to the world of descriptive metrics. The second guy in there is an amazing individual. He's in 4 HR Halls of Fame. I didn't even know there were HR Halls of Fame, but he's apparently in 4 of them. He's a mentor of mine. His name's Dr. Wayne Cascio. And he's the one that really turned around and said, okay, at an HR function level, how do we start measuring the shareholder value of HR? Right? How do I look at benefits administration? How do I look at talent? What does that really look like? And started kind of bringing that, CHRO lens to HR in terms of measurement. He's absolutely amazing. He's at the University of Denver. He's been a prolific author. So if you kind of go, Dr. Jack was kind of functional, right? How do I run talent acquisition? How do I run learning? You've got Wayne Cascio, that's kind of CHRO. And then you had Dr. John Boudreau, who really took HR and workforce planning to kind of that financial level. He was the first one that really kind of said, listen, you've got to understand the critical value that employees play for their companies, and started really painting that picture of where you should allocate your investments. One of his fun examples in one of his books called Beyond HR is he really put forth this idea of pivotal employee, where he said, if you are an airline industry, where would you want to spend your money on your talent by role? And and we didn't have a poll set up for this, so I'll just kind of give you. A lot of people will pick the route person. Somebody may pick pilot. Somebody may pick the flight attendant. But usually, the majority of folks will pick the pilots. And what he paints the picture on is actually for airlines, they need good pilots. They don't need the best pilots, right? Long as the pilots can take the plane off and land the plane, right, we're okay, right? If they were in the Blue Angels, that may be interesting, but probably not relevant, right? What he points out is the pivotal employee on an airline is the right? Because how often have you been on one of those rides where you're like the flight attendants, tell stories saying, do some amazing things where you're like, I'm going to keep on flying this airline. He started creating that concept of really attaching revenue to key roles inside of an organization. So that was 2007. And up to this point, we all had been using common enterprise tools to really try to measure human capital, in which case it wasn't until 2010 that a great guy by John Schwartz created Visier. For folks that have been in the industry a really long time, he was the one who founded and sold ReportNet. And so he used that to go create Visier. And it's the first HR analytics product where it was kind of has its own dashboarding. Because what he realized is he said, human resources at that time, business partners, really didn't understand how to do the quantitative side of this, right? So he really created kind of easy, pre-done dashboards that they could use when they're sitting down with hiring managers. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're thinking about where we're at today, and that was only 2010 when the first HR application was developed for analytics. 2014, what was interesting here is the standards is what's called the Global Reporting Index. These are voluntary or extra financial standards that companies report out on. So these are where companies report out on, do they have conflict minerals? What's their carbon footprint look like? Well, in 2014, they started inserting some HR metrics in here. How much money do you spend on learning per employee, right? Because what's happening is shareholders are beginning to ask those questions because they realized if you look at two companies that are similar. So let's say two aerospace companies, let's say aerospace manufacturing. There's kind of an intrinsic business model that everyone kind of has the same cost of goods. They have the same EBITDA, right? They kind of run same revenues. Their PE ratios are fairly similar. But you may have two firms that are kind of looking the same on most of the public data, but one of them, let's say, is turning over 15% of their employees every year. One of them's turning over 5%. Well, which one would you want to invest in? The one that's losing all their talent or the one that's keeping their talent? And so, but the SEC for the longest time, the United States has not required any firm to release their human capital data. The only data that you have to release is anything from a pension liability standpoint, any HR lawsuits that reach a materiality threshold, and you have to list the pay of the top 5 employees. That's it. So GRI was shareholders starting to say, tell me more about what's going on inside of your firm. Right? Because we know it's the people that are driving the value. Then ISO got involved in 2016, started building the workforce planning standard. I had the privilege of being on that committee, and the ISO group that started saying, we've got to figure this out from an HR perspective. 2017, we finally did our first cost per hire standard. And again, this hopefully also gives you the idea of how nascent human capital analytics is. It was only a couple of years ago, and no kidding, it's a 28-page document on how you calculate cost per hire. I had no idea if you put 30 nations in a room that there'd be so many opinions on how do you calculate this. But probably the biggest news is, coming up to the upper right, right? And what is really important is the SEC is now figured in understanding what other countries have started to figure out because of GRI, is saying the intrinsic value of companies is because of its people. And if you look at what normally has been in income sheets, balance sheets, right, normal reportable information, you can't get a view into companies' people. And so regulators and shareholders and PE and venture capital groups have really been pressuring, saying we've got to get some exposure to this. So in August of last year, you can see in the lower right-hand corner, the SEC has created a new standard that's going to be going into effect this year, saying the companies are going to have to start reporting on human capital measures that affect the materiality of their company, right? And this is a huge news for anybody that's in the human capital analytics space, because now you're going to have kind of this top-down pull. So just know coming into 2020, we were already kind of in this, listen, people are going to be incredibly important to our businesses, right? The SEC was doing this, so imagine kind of where the industry from a human capital analytics perspective was. And then obviously COVID happened, right? It started kicking off. And what you're seeing here is a framework that we put in place to kind of help guide our clients. There's a lot on the slide. I'm not going to read it all to you. But just the biggest piece I want to make sure that you get is, we created 3 steps, right, in terms of time frames. One is respond. because you had a lot of companies that initially were in, what do I do? What's my risk? Where do I need to spend my time? Where do I need to, spend my executives? What's happening in my supply chain? What's happening in my customer base? Right, they are very much in that respond stage, right? Kind of piece number one. Piece number two is we were working companies through how do they recover? And I'm going to dig a little bit more into this because I'm going to give you examples of some of the analytics underneath each one of these. Because recover is a very complex question, and I'll walk you through some of this. And then the thrive piece, right, is once people kind of get to kind of quote unquote the new normal, right, then we're all going to start thriving again, right? And it may look very different in certain industries as to what thrive looks like, but these are the questions that we've been asking our clients and helping guide them through. One of the first things that Deloitte did is, we realized when it came with COVID is we did a bunch of case studies on Chinese companies. And the reason being is obviously they were kind of in the leading edge. They had the opportunity to get exposed to this first, both literally and figuratively. And as a result, they had to figure out their business models and what the impacts were. So on the left-hand side, it gives you some idea of what we started realizing based on the learnings of our case studies with Chinese clients. And what became very apparent was resilience is going to be key. That there is no one set, here's the 10 things that you need to do. The reality is that it's going to vary by city, by customer base, by industry, by what's going on in your supply chain, that there is not a formula for any one company or industry to say, here's how we're going to thrive or take care of our employees or take care of our customers, because there's so much variation by this. So that really helped us figure out that for us, a core underpinning of how Deloitte has been helping our clients respond in this during the pandemic is leveraging digital data. That has been a key component of that. So what you're seeing here is one of the first things that we quickly did. One of the products that we've had for over a decade is this product called Predict Risk. And for every, and I love this audience because it's a whole bunch of data people, right? That people love data science. As you can imagine, there's those marketing databases, right? These massive marketing databases that know what magazines you subscribe to, right? What websites you go to, what shoes brands you wear. So just think those massive databases. But they are massive. I mean, just to give you an idea, we've got access to a couple that basically have information on every adult American in terms of what their buying habits are, consumer behaviors, things like that. And over the last 10 years, we've been building predictive models off of that have allowed us to predict 21 different disease states. So, what I mean by that is based on your consumer behavior, we can predict the likelihood that you may have cardiac issues, that you may have asthma issues, that you may have diabetes. And this has been used by the insurance sector, saying, how do we understand what the risk areas are, right? Because it's not using PHI, it's not, we're truly using it off of people's consumer behavior. So we've had this product out there, and when the pandemic started, what we realized very quickly is we were able to create models that allowed us to predict the likelihood that if someone contracted COVID-19, that they would have complications. So just to be very clear, we weren't predicting if someone would catch COVID-19, but if they caught COVID-19, what's the likelihood that they would have a health complication? And so we quickly put together this data. We scored areas, and we turned around, and the first company, we first took it out to federal, state, and local agencies. New York was our first customer, as you can imagine. And there was a situation here in that most, if you think about states, don't have access to their citizens' health data. Aside from like Medicare and some of the claim data there, they just don't have a good view as to the health of their citizen population. And so when it came to what's the risk of COVID-19, there was a really big blind spot for all of these states saying, where are risk areas? So what our system was able to do is we basically took all the citizens of New York, scored them, showed what the risk level was, and it allowed New York to quickly figure out, as COVID spread across the state of New York, where their hotspots were going to be. And so they were able to say, we need our ventilators. Where do we need to put temporary hospitals, right? Where do we need, we've got backup staffing. And we could turn around and also help them understand things in here that we had, where were the pharmacies, where were the hospitals, things like that. Katharine, any questions so far?
There's one actually from BJ that we can cover off on while you're still on this. He asked, how do we figure out what kinds of data to use? Reliable and dated, or unreliable, like inventory turns, contemporary, like GIS?
This is reliable because it's using, there's a lot of data in the consumer databases. It is all purchase data that kind of, go into these systems. So think loyalty cards, things like that. So this is not induced data in terms of the raw underpieces. Now, obviously, the predictive algorithms, have, a lot of modeling going on inside of them, but we've been able to validate those models against true health claim data over the last 10 years. So as you can imagine, we first went and said, how do we get data to, organizations that need this first and foremost, right? And that was our first responders, hospitals, federal, state, and local agencies. Then from here, we said, employers are asking the exact same questions, right? Employers were saying, what do I need to do about my employee risk? What is my employee risk? Where do I need to be worrying about locations? And this is obviously a different population from a buying perspective. And just to be perfectly clear, when Deloitte put the previous product and this product out to the market, there are some contractors involved, and every one of us did this almost for free. There were a couple hard costs that we couldn't make completely free, but this was not a commercial entity offering God in its normal sense. So what we did for employers is we have the ability of, they give us their employee file, all right? We're able to score those individuals, and because of the data granularity, we can score everyone in that household. So we were able to come back and say, we know the risk of an employee if they had complications from COVID-19. And we kind of did, medium and high risk. We also know their household risk, right? So the employee may be a healthy individual, but they may be dealing with an elder care situation. And we wanted to make sure, because employers are going, listen, I don't want to not understand what those situations are, right? I don't want employees are ready or safe, right? But they may be worried about an area opening up, and they're going, listen, I'm still not going to expose myself because I've got somebody that's immunocompromised. In my exact situation, I have a son who's immunocompromised. Until there's a vaccine, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to go out. Right. So this data, what we were able to do for employers very quickly is we gave them 14 different dashboards that allowed them to look at a number of dimensions, right? So we could tell them their risk by location, function, business units, and occupation type. And it allowed them to plan appropriately, right? So if they said, finance has an issue in California and I've got an audit coming up, what do I need to do? Or if I have locations that have higher risk than other locations, can I reroute work somehow, right? And not expose people as much? Are there, continuing succession planning issues? So our goal was to very quickly give our employers in a way to start trying to at least answer some of those questions from kind of a directional standpoint. Katharine, any questions so far?
Yeah, we've had two good ones come in.
Okay.
The first one is, where does the employee household data come from? Is it benefits information, or where else would those data sources be?
So the only way to answer this is it's going to make the database sound a little creepy. And just so you know, we subscribe to these databases. It's not actually like Deloitte owns it. But these marketing databases literally have information on every adult American. So when you give me a street address, so if you took my street address, you would have information for my wife, son, and me. And so as a result, you would have 3 data points returned for that household. So when they gave us the employee's first name, last name, street address, and zip code, we would be able to pull back an aggregate score for that household also. So it is pulling from everyone's individual consumer data. So it's not pulling any healthcare data at all. So that was second question. These are good questions.
Yeah, similar actually, and I think kind of in the same vein. How are employees balancing these concerns with EEO laws and equal opportunity for all employees to kind of earn money or do their jobs? That might be more downstream impact.
Yeah, it is a little bit of a downstream impact. I can answer the question, but let me share one. I'll answer a question, but also kind of address an issue that sometimes comes up with this. Is on the employer version, what we did is we locked down, so they only had access to the dashboards. They could not get to the raw data. And we limited how far an employer could get down to, so they could only derive down to 100 people So they would, so they couldn't accidentally figure out Bob in McAllen, Texas, had high risk. So we did do some things to kind of anonymize data because we wanted to make sure they had enough to be directional, but we didn't want to expose individual employees. So kind of piece number one. Piece number two, though, the EEOC, there's a really interesting clause at the American Discrimination, the ADA Act, and a couple other acts actually have exclusions for pandemics. So when the government declared that we were suffering from a pandemic, it wasn't just a normal noun, it has legal implications. And so the minute they did that, companies are allowed to do some things that historically would not be allowed because we are in a pandemic. So an example would be, if you're in the middle of a hiring process, if they asked you if you were positive for COVID-19 and you said yes, they could cancel the hire, right? Something under ADA normally would not be allowed. Under pandemic rules it is. So think about, an example where today many of the restaurants that are opening are, they're doing temperature tests, right? Their employees when they come to work. Under normal situations, that would not be allowed. Under pandemic rules, it's allowed. So just know the EEOC has put out two versions. They put out one very quick, and then they put out another one that's about 40 pages long of how the regulations have changed specific to pandemic rules. They're saying, listen, be careful, because you can't discriminate it for other things, but there are some things in pandemic that you're allowed to do that normally you couldn't. Other questions?
Got one more question, and then I'll take the rest at the end, but I think this will segue into the next part of your presentation. Is this changing how companies plan to invest in employees in the future and where that changes their priorities?
Fantastic question. All right, so that brings us to the next slide, where we get to recover. And there's two things that are happening very quickly, and this is where a lot of really cool data started coming, is, companies are starting to say, when we start recovering, what does this world look like? And you've seen a little bit of it in the press, right? People have seen, one of the social media sites that have told their employees, if you want to work from home, you can work from home forever. But what we started doing is starting to figure employers going, let's gather employee sentiment data, right? What are your employee sentiments right now, right? Do they want to come back? Are they able to come back? Are they nervous? Are they able to get their work done? So we did a lot of survey and sentiment analysis, right? Kind of piece number one, we layered in predict risk data. We would also look at kind of their location analysis, but we quite a few things that we'd start looking at companies to help them on their recover plans, right? And oh, by the way, these were not simple because it would vary by, state and county as to where they're at. There are certain places that are able to recover. There's other ones in countries that we know are going to take a little longer. So we would start building these charts, right? These decision matrix, where we start putting in all this data saying, these are ones that are able to work from home. These are ones, individual work. Is there work that can be retasked, right? Can we redefine some jobs to make it where it's happening? Maybe an employee was going, listen, I can only get 80% of my work done from home. Okay, what can we do to redefine the other 20%? So we've been doing a lot of data gathering and analysis around, role types. We have a product called Photo where we've analyzed every occupation code in the United States, and we can tell at a sub-level what those tasks can be done remotely and not remotely. So sometimes we're helping firms redefine jobs, right, and what they're looking like. So now what companies are realizing is they're saying, okay, not everyone's coming back to work, right? We don't need everyone to come back, because the one thing that this has taught us is, we can do kind of that future of work virtual piece much faster than we thought we could, right? I think no one of us chose to have done it. But the reality is we're learning that people can work from home, right? And a lot of places firms can work from home. So one of the things that's happening now is we're starting to say, okay, well, this has massive implications to corporate real estate. So as firms are thinking about recover, what we're doing is we're actually helping them figure out, okay, what's the space requirements from a social distancing standpoint on the corporate footprints that they have? What's the employees that want to come back or need to come back? What's the space that's needed? You'll see in some places that they're overloaded, in some places they're underloaded, in which case, our firm's going to have, headquarters or regional offices that they no longer need. And what does that look like? So companies are starting to realize that work is changing very rapidly. And so they're starting to say, okay, what do we need to do to change our infrastructure around our people? And I think to kind of answer the question, the one overarching piece that we are hearing from all of our clients, regardless of industry type, is they've all absolutely rallied around it's about our employees, right? And understanding that in some cases, we haven't chosen to work this way, but what can we do to make it supportive? In other cases, it's all right, how do we continue? Because we're learning some things that are positive out of this, in which case, what can we do to continue to leverage those things?
I know a lot of the students on this call are probably going to work for, large companies that have offices in different areas. Is this a dashboard that we put together for, a large company that does have, regional offices in a lot of different places, and that kind of helps them choose how to phase their approach, and then maybe some longer term decisions on space and renting versus buying properties and such like that? Is this kind of for one company, or would it be more of an aggregate based on location?
This is one company. The prototype, obviously it's fake data for purposes of, since this is for an open environment. But this is what we're doing for companies at a company level. Where we're saying, okay, what's happening with your locations today? From your return to work strategy, what's that going to do to impact your locations? And then the pieces that we've got, and it's I didn't bring it into this. It really doesn't have to do with analytics, but we actually have administrative tools that are allowing firms to do contact tracing and do the administrative piece of, as they're allowing employees back to work. Have they had an antibody test? Have they had COVID-19? Do they have a high-risk household? And there's some administrative processes, tools that we've built with a great partner, Salesforce, that are allowing firms to kind of help administer this process. So I think the piece that I want to make sure everyone kind of takes away from is kind of two things. One is, what we were able to realize rapidly is, you've probably heard about the digital economy, right? You've heard about Industry 4.0. And what Deloitte was able to help with is that data has been critical to every company and how they're reacting to this pandemic, right? So if you've got that background and you're focused on business analytics, know its importance and criticality is just becoming even more cemented, right? Kind of piece number one. Piece number two is both as future employees or current employees or folks that are interested in human capital analytics, know that this is also an incredible time that companies are realizing the importance of employees, right? It is that human capital piece is coming down from a shareholder standpoint. And so companies are really having to do this analysis correctly, because it is that important to their long-term survival and their shareholder returns.
Several questions. I'm going to kind of go out of order in which they were asked. The one that's probably most relevant to what you were just talking about is, as work from home is now proved to be possible for many companies, do you see a trend that companies are leaning towards offshore labor? Is that part of the analysis at all?
It's not. Because I think because that equation's always been out there, right? So kind of onshoring, nearshoring, offshoring. I think that's something that that calculus has always been there, and this really hasn't affected that, right? It's really kind of affecting what your nearshoring looks like. I think, because there's other constraints that affect kind of that worldview. I think in a perfect world, we'd say this means a company could hire employees from anywhere around the globe, right? I think, this has proved virtually we could do that. The challenges comes from, taxes and payroll and HR, that, it's not easy for companies to hire from 25 different countries and create a virtual company. And that really doesn't have anything to do with kind of working from home. It has to do with the regulatory aspects of creating companies inside of countries.
The next question came from one of your previous slides when we were talking about the kind of changing risk levels. With the fact that these risk levels seem to be changing constantly, how do you kind of keep the model current when new risk factors seem to be coming up kind of on a daily basis?
So we have doctors and relationships with the CDC and several other institutions. So just in terms of feedback loop of the underlying medical conditions and how things are changing, we've got that feedback loop created, inside the model, right? So just kind of piece number one. Piece number two is obviously we're getting daily feeds of, here's what's going on in terms of infections. There's some great data out there in terms of hospital staffing rates, bed availability, things like that. Because obviously some of the things have changed in terms of risk level. The children, the Kawasaki syndrome is something that was new. Now, unfortunately for us, that's affecting people under the age 18, and for the most part, and I'm going to use that loosely. There's some folks that are kind of in the 2021 range. but our model is designed for adults, because that's where we are legally allowed to have the consumer data. So we're kind of, unfortunately, got a little bit of a blind spot when it comes to calculating risk for children because we just don't have the data.
How did you train the model? And I know there's several models. I think this was asked on the second respond.
Yeah, so this one, you probably have somebody very technical that may be asking a really deep question on this one. So the individual models, like our asthma model, our diabetes models, right? The individual concurrent models, those were all trained over the last decade in supervised training models, right? So we had medical claim data, we were able to prove these consumer behaviors, and that's how we were able to do the validity testing on those, right? So we know the asthma model is right. We know the cardiac, issue, model is right. So we've got kind of those 21 different disease states. There obviously was not a way to train a COVID model. So what the COVID model does, and this is why we've been working with the medical industry so well and deeply on this, is that they've been identifying the underlying complications and what the risk levels are, saying if you have one or two of the underlying indications, we would rate you as medium. If you have two or higher or three or higher, your risk is high. And so we're not training at that level just because you don't have the feedback loop. But the national, the NHS in the UK, they did validate. They've come back and said, listen, it's these underlying conditions that were leading to mortality or hospitality events. So there's been some validation that those were the right complications in that regards. But obviously we don't have client medical data to do it at the COVID level. Hopefully that answered your question, because I feel like somebody who was behind the scenes was really smart and asking the right question on that one.
No, that was great. Last question, I'm going to combine it with one other kind of final thought too. Do you expect the current levels of flexibility to carry through to the long term for employee benefits, especially for new parents or people caring for elderly parents? And then the second part of that I'm adding in, you mentioned your very first slide about how we're at a really exciting time for healthcare analytics. Do you see this focus on healthcare analytics continuing to grow, partly because of COVID-19, and what kind of long-term implications do you see for healthcare analytics as a whole?
For human capital analytics, we were already starting to take off at the end of 2019. Right. We were all, it was all, with the SEC support and things like that, there was a lot of things going on that were going to make this an amazing space. That it was finally kind of coming due because of the support it was getting. I think, part of the driver was over 70% of the United States' GDP is based on services, the service industry sector, which means that there's people, right, that are driving the value of that firm. What the pandemic has made companies realize is, when you don't have, it's kind of easy to get lost in, I have a company, I have a building, right? People can look at their company as an it, right? Well, when everyone's virtual, you start realizing it's all these people that are working in their houses, right? You've got kids and cats and everyone's showing up in the background. And I do think it's brought that human-centric perspective to the table. And so the question is that going to extend? And I think, I'll just give you an example. Our firm, and there's been a couple other firms that have come out and said, listen, this Friday, take it off, right? Mandatory disconnect days. And there's been a couple other firms that have done the exact same thing because they're realizing, and just to give you an idea of how people are being sensitive to this, there are several firms, including ourselves, that track how much paid time off has been done. And under the pandemic, people have not been taking their PTO. There's also been data showing that people are working on average 3 hours longer every day. Well, that's not healthy. Right, that's not something that allows us to bring our best to the table. And so, you have these firms that put in these disconnect days where they're going, listen, we need people to stop. Right, we know there's a lot of anxiety going on, and that's going to affect people's mental wellness. So we want to make sure that we're creating an environment where people know we need to bring your best. We don't need you working 20 hours a day out of fear of you might lose your job. Right, and I will admit we're in I'm in a blessed organization and blessed situation where. We're not in that situation. We know there's companies and individuals who are, but we want to make sure people stay healthy. And, that's where things about worrying about elder care and situations like that, your more responsive firms are saying, listen, we understand if someone needs to go on flex work. You may have two people, two parents working from home and they've got a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old. Someone's going to have to adjust their shift, right? So, I mean, this is just my personal opinion. I think, we're seeing a much more of a focus on, the human experience, right? Coming out of this from an employer perspective.
Well, that takes us to the end of our allocated Q&A time. There were a few more questions that came in at the end. So welcome you guys to kind of take a look at those, and maybe if people have perspectives on it or want to talk about it in small groups, we can do that in the breakout, or I'll send them out. Franz, if you've got time to answer any of them offline, we can see if that's possible as well. But I find all of this fascinating. It's a new normal that I wasn't expecting to find myself in. I don't think I've ever really put much thought to HR analytics before, but suddenly that's at the top of all of our clients and my personal life. So this has been really, really interesting to talk about.